So this is part 2 of the drop braid stitch tutorial, and here I'm just going to do a more in-depth video on how to do the drop stitch braids, starting with, this is our 48th needle, so we start our first braid at our first and our second needle. So once we get to our first needle where you want to start doing your drop stitch braids, you want to take your loom pick or your crochet hook, or even you can use your fingers, and you want to drop the stitch on purpose. So make it so as the machine's cranking around, it's not going to catch the yarn on the yarn holder for the number 1 and the number 2 needle. Now you do want it to make sure it's still seated down into the yarn holder, because you want it to then catch on the number 3 needle. So make sure that's all seated down, because it could sometimes pop out of there. So after we have that, our number 1 and our number 2 needle we have dropped, and then we want to catch the yarn into the number 3 needle, and that's just going to connect it into place. So now we're going to drop our stitches on purpose. I like using my loom pick. Just pick those loops off of the pegs and pick out the bars of the yarn. And again, I like doing 58. I cranked 60 rows, and I did about 58 rows that I cranked down, because you don't want to go all the way down to your cast on. You want to keep the 2 loops intact. Pull them up with your loom pick, and then you can transfer these 2 loops onto your crochet hook. And you can do as many of these as you would like. I'm just doing 58 here. If you wanted to do the whole hat as well, so whether you turned it inside out or right side out, it had a braid, you could do that as well. The only important thing you just need to remember is at the end, when you go to put the yarn back on to the machine, you want 2 bars left on your crochet hook. So if I dropped 58 stitches, for my first slip stitch I do only 2 bars, and then the rest I do 3, and then you'll end up only having 2 bars left over on your crochet hook at the end, and then you're able to put them back onto your machine. So I'll just show this a little bit more in depth doing the slip stitch. I like the look of the 3 bars, giving it a little bit more definition to the braid, but you could do whatever you would like at this point. You could do 3 or 4 or 5, whatever look you want to go for. But just remember, at the end, I'll speed this up so you can see the slip stitches. At the end, you'll just need to hook up the 2 bars back onto your machine. So here we are at the last one. I just have 2 bars left over now. I do a slip stitch, and now we can put them back onto the machine. And again, I like using my loom pick for this. So I take the first loop off of the crochet hook, I put that on the number 1 needle, and so it's just the needle to the right, my right, and then I take the second loop off the crochet hook and I put it on the number 2 needle, the needle to the left. And you just want to make sure it's on both pegs, seated all the way down, and that can be the little bit difficult part to get them back on. So as long as you get on one, do the other, and then use your loom pick to get the loop seated on both of them. So this just takes a little bit of time, a little bit of patience. Don't try to rush through this part so you don't drop the stitches. You just need it seated over those 2 pegs, your entire loop. So now this is our first braid that's done. Now to start the next braid. So again, on our first braid, we drop needle 1 and 2. So now you need to make sure that the next needles, like 3, 4, 5, 6, that when you're cranking these down, that yarn is getting hooked onto those needles. And so since I only did 4 braids on this project, I just made them evenly spaced. So the next ones you're going to drop is needles 12 and 13. So we just crank it around, making sure everything's getting hooked. And then when we get to needle 12 and 13, we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to take our loom pick and take that yarn and put it over to the back side of both needles, so we can then drop the stitch. For needle 14, I'm going to make sure it gets caught So just make sure it's seated all the way down in that yarn holder. And then right there, it catches on needle 14. And then we're going to do the same thing. We are going to remove the loops off of our 2 needles, 12 and 13, that we dropped the stitches on purpose, and then pick out the stitches. And then when you get as many as you want picked out, again, I did 58, pick up the 2 loops. You just don't want to go all the way down to the cast on. Make sure you still have 2 loops intact you can pick up. And then you're going to do the braid slip stitch back up the same way you did the first one. So that'll be 2 bars. And then after the 2 bars are done, slip stitch 3 bars. And then at the end, you should have 2 bars left that you hook back up to your machine. Okay, so now that we're at the end of the braid, we're going to do the same thing. You just want 2 bars left on your crochet hook at the end so you can hook them up to the needles again, needles 12 and 13. And I like using my loom pick to do this. And because this does get pretty tight at the end here, you just want to take your time. Don't pull too much up. You need to get the fabric back underneath those big pegs as well, and this will help so you don't pop off any other stitches. And so just take your time when doing this. And sometimes I can get it with the crochet hook and everything. Sometimes I have to use my fingers. So now that your second braid's done, needles 14, 15, 16, and so on are going to be cranked like normal. Make sure they get hooked under the needles. And then we're going to do for our third braid at needle 24 and 25. You want to put the yarn back behind those needles because we're going to drop those 2. And you can do your braids wherever you would like. This is just so I'm evenly spacing them, and I started at needles 1 and 2. And now we're just going to do the same thing. After I drop 24 and 25, I just make sure needle 26 hooks the yarn. This is just so I make sure everything's ready to go, and it kind of hooks that yarn into place. And now we're going to, again, drop the stitches all the way down. I did 58 of them, and then I pick up the 2 loops, and then we're going to do that slip stitch back up the same exact way. First, you're going to hook up 2 bars with your first slip stitch, and then the next ones are going to be 3 bars that we slip stitch together, and then at the end you'll have 2 bars left over so you can hook them back up to your 24th and your 25th needle. And I'll just speed this up till we get to the end. And then now that we're back to the end, we should just have 2 loops left on our crochet hook. I like putting the first loop closest to the hook onto the right needle. We want it down those 2 pegs, and then the second loop I like to put onto the left 2 pegs. And then you have the bigger pegs that are above in between the needles. You just want to make sure the fabric's up and underneath those. That helps keep it from pulling the other stitches off of the other needles. So now again, we're just going to start cranking the rest of our rows, making sure the needles catch the yarn. And then for our fourth and final braid, to make it evenly spaced, it's going to be needle 36 and 37 that we are going to drop. And we'll use that with my loom pick. So I dropped one, dropped the second one, and then needle, so that was 36 and 37, needle 38. Again, I'm going to make sure that one actually catches the yarn so it hooks everything back up so I can continue on with no issues. And we'll do the same thing, unpick the last 2, drop the stitches, pick up the 2 loops at the bottom, and then now slip stitch it back up all the way to the top. And then again, when you're doing this, try not to pull your fabric up so it doesn't pull the loops off of the other needles. This is especially important when you get back up to the top here. You want to make sure that you have them under the big pegs, the fabric going underneath them, and then you don't want to pull up or out too much so it doesn't any of the other stitches on the other needles. So I hope this helps doing a little bit more in-depth tutorial of making all 4 braids. Please like and follow for more. And if you have any questions about how to do the braid drop stitch, please let me know in the comments. I'd be happy to answer them as best as I can. Happy crafting, everybody.